Yeah, it's insanity. It just this whole mentality of strength versus weakness, and we have to show strength, and Putin's automatically Hitler, even if he's not. I mean, all of these false assumptions that blind Western leaders into pursuing actions that are most detrimental to their own people and to their own security. I mean, that's the crazy thing is, I'm a champion of U.S. national security, and I dare anyone to show evidence otherwise. But I believe that the U.S. should only defend its vital interests, and those vital interests don't extend into Russia's and China's sphere of influence. Russia and China have spheres of influence whether we admit it or not.
Hello, this is Pascal, and I'm joined today by another realist voice for diplomacy in the ongoing war in Ukraine. Dr. David Pyne is the Deputy Director of National Operations for the EMP Task Force. He served as a United States Army officer and worked as an international programs manager on the Department of Army Headquarters staff. He's an authority with regards to the US, Russian, and Chinese nuclear arsenals, US and Russian missile defense systems, and EMP weapons. Dr. Pyne holds an MA in National Security Studies from Georgetown University and a Doctor of Jurisprudence from Southwestern University School of Law. He's the author of the newsletter, The Real War, and he wrote several articles in the national interest about the threat of nuclear escalation in the war in Ukraine. For instance, he recently wrote a passionate plea for the return to diplomacy. His peace activism even landed him on a notorious list published by the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, which is itself part of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, of 35 high-profile Americans who they accuse of information terrorism, subject to being tried as war criminals. That's what that list actually says, that these people should be tried as war criminals. Dr. Pyne, David, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, you are on this Ukrainian blacklist, together with names like Tulsi Gabbard, Steven Seagal, Tucker Carlson, and, my personal hero in the European Parliament, Claire Daly, who all advocate for less escalation and more talk, more diplomacy. Basically, anyone who advocates against further weapon deliveries and for negotiated peace is targeted by that list published by an official state body of Ukraine. How does this make you feel, and what are your thoughts on that list?
It's really ironic to be described as an information terrorist and war criminal for opposing the war criminals, right? I mean, it's the real crime is the war itself. I mean, war in itself is not a war crime, but the fact that we're having this war that's completely unnecessary and could have been avoided through diplomacy, and could have been stopped early, many months ago, if we'd been willing, as an American, if President Biden had been willing to talk to President Putin, or really at any level to negotiate a settlement along with Ukraine, the war could have been ended a long time ago. But this agency, it's the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation. It's a really Orwellian term because its primary purpose within the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is to disseminate Ukrainian propaganda and disinformation. So it's not those of us on the list, these 35 Americans, of which you noted that I'm one of them, that's responsible for issuing disinformation or let alone Russian propaganda.
This term and this entire mentality that has developed now about drawing everybody in on the same side and being on the same page, as in we have to deliver weapons, and I say we because the Europeans do the same, although I'm Swiss. The Swiss don't, and that they have been criticized by Ukraine for that. And anyone who says there should be another solution, they're being decried, usually as either Russian propagandists or the other term, appeasers. And you are a former army officer of the United States. You work in this task force that thinks about very real threats to the US. Are you a blue-eyed idealist who thinks it's all going to be peace and happiness if we give Russia and Putin everything they want? Or what is your take at how, I mean, what's your take at all of these accusations of being appeasers?
You know, it's ridiculous. I mean, it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of the lessons of World War II, which were not that appeasement didn't start the war. Any obvious non-observer understands that it was not appeasement, but the abandonment of appeasement of Germany that started the war. Because if you appease a country, you know, then they won't start a war because there's a peaceful diplomatic settlement. And so, you know, this idea that appeasement was a bad thing, you know, didn't start until 1939. In 1938, during the Munich Pact, it was that agreement was universally hailed as avoiding, and rightly so, by the way, avoiding the Second World War. And then, of course, Hitler made a series of very rash and stupid errors that, you know, became the evil mass murder dictator we all know. And in the process, you know, Chamberlain made that guarantee of Poland that, you know, led to World War II. But we see a lot of that same mentality here today. This is not Putin is not Hitler. Putin's not even he's not a Stalin. He's not bent on you know, conquering the rest of the former Soviet Union, let alone Eastern Europe. So we need to deal in reality. And Putin is a man of limited objectives. President Xi, I would argue, is much less limited in his desire to rule the world, at least economically, and then, of course, to conquer Taiwan. But in the case of Putin, he didn't even want to invade Ukraine. That was kind of his fallback choice. He wanted to get a written guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality issued by the United States and NATO. And in December of last year, he actually issued a mutual security agreement, which you know, which would have peacefully avoided the war and would have resolved actually all the outstanding issues between NATO and the Russian Federation. So those are missed opportunities that you know, we should have availed ourselves of. And you know, diplomacy is still the key to averting an unnecessary world war, which it would undoubtedly escalate to the nuclear level. In terms of the allegation of appeasement, I mean, for people like me, I actually support tripling the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal and escalating our nuclear alert status to DEFCON 3. So, you know, people can accuse me of being an appeaser, but I'm very, very strong when it comes to defending the United States of America. And the policy that I'm representing is the U.S. national security interests. You know, the Biden administration, neoconservative Republican warmongers in Congress, for example, seem to have decided that it's in the U.S. interest to make essentially outsource our Russia policy to President Zelensky in Ukraine. And that's a very dangerous thing, because Zelensky's been he's been asking for preemptive U.S. nuclear strikes on Russia. You know, since Russia is clearly considering escalating the nuclear level, you know, tactical nuclear level in Ukraine. And that's just madness. I mean, there's so much madness that's coming out of the Zelensky regime, and he's actually assassinating a lot of Ukrainian leaders and citizens who support peace. And I've been told more than once that if I were to visit Ukraine, I would likely be assassinated by the Ukrainian SBU.
There's 11 opposition parties that are banned in Ukraine. There's ample evidence that the state itself is, I mean, apart from facing war, also facing tremendous internal struggles. So the levels of problems that we are having at the moment are just mind-boggling. And one of the worst things is that this confrontation seems to be spreading. We now have an attack on civilian infrastructure, the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, by somebody. Some people claim it was Russia, which I find, if it was Russia, it would be an extremely weird choice, like attacking your own pipelines. But okay, let's not go into that debate. But the destruction is spreading. how can we get back to diplomacy realistically without thinking like, okay, we just Zelensky and Putin have to wake up tomorrow and have a change of hearts? Like, how do we get back to talking to each other realistically? I had a guest on this podcast a few days ago who says the grain agreement that was struck in order to export grain again from Ukraine could be a kernel of like starting this. Where do you see like serious chances for diplomacy?
Well, it's very simple, really. It's fantastically simple. All we need to do is follow, my peace proposal, latest peace proposal out of 3, which was published in the National Interest this past weekend, and that is to call for a ceasefire in order to ensure Ukrainian independence. Many of your listeners may or may not be aware that President Putin's mobilization order is not an order for partial mobilization. It's an order for full mobilization. It has no limits to the number of Russian troops that can be mobilized. So clearly, Putin is sending a signal that he is willing to escalate to any level in order to ensure peace on Russian terms in Ukraine. So, Russia's had peace terms since day 2 of the war. I was just reading and researching a new article. I saw an article that Zelensky accepted Russia's peace offer to meet for peace talks on February 25th, the day after the invasion. So, Russia has, despite obviously initiating this illegal war of aggression, they have continued. They've been open to peace, and Putin actually said that in his most recent address on September 21st, that he's still very much open to peace negotiations that would, produce a compromise negotiated settlement. Zelensky, on the other hand, has said that not only would he reject any peace negotiations with Russia, so long as it's led by President Putin, but he actually signed a decree to make it official U.S. or official Ukrainian law that no peace negotiations could occur with Russia. Now, once those troops are mobilized in Russia and deployed to Ukraine, could increase the number of Russian troops by a factor of 600%, and that will fundamentally change the momentum in the war, because you may not realize that Russia has been fighting outnumbered by Ukraine in terms of troops by about 3 to 1 during the entirety of the war. Yet they still managed to conquer, and hold 19% of Ukrainian territory, which they've since annexed in an illegal annexation, of course, I would say. But once those troops arrive, it's going to be about 2 to 1 Russian superiority, and Ukraine will fall within a matter of months. So we have maybe 6 months until Ukraine is totally defeated. That's assuming that there's no Russian nuclear escalation, which could win the war in a single day, which the Biden national security policy is essentially maximizing the chances of Russian nuclear escalation, which is very troubling. But really, it's just a matter of declaring a ceasefire, having an armistice agreement, and then negotiating peace. But the war could be ended simply by, really it could be President Biden alone who could say, we're going to suspend arms to Ukraine if Russia accepts this ceasefire proposal. And I can almost guarantee you that Putin would accept it, because he's been very motivated for peace. Even though Elon Musk's peace proposal was quite unfavorable to Russia, much more favorable to Ukraine, it was Russia that praised it, and it was Ukraine that denounced it in the most vehement terms. And I found the same thing to be the case with my own peace proposals, which to date have been more favorable to Ukraine, I would argue, than Russia, or at least balanced. But Ukraine has just been adamant against any peace process whatsoever.
When we look at it, there's often the accusation that we fundamentally misunderstand Putin, and we think of Putin as somebody who is open for negotiation. But either some people say, no, he's a crazy maniac, he will never go for peace, and others say, like, no, he's just Hitler, he's evil, he's the devil himself, he will roll on, right, and he will try to recreate the Soviet Empire. which to me seems a ridiculous thing, a ridiculous analysis, because that's not what they are doing in Central Asia. That's not what's happening in the relationship with Mongolia. That's not what's happening in the relationship with Moldova. But this accusation keeps flying in, and then it empowers the argument to say that there can be no negotiated peace. It needs to be Ukraine that reconquers all of its territories. And by now we have the situation where, together with Crimea, Russia has incorporated 4 more territories by law, by its own constitution, into its state body. And I think the next step is pretty obvious. If there's not going to be a negotiation to end this, Russia will declare real war. Until now, it's a limited military operation, but at the moment they decide that now our territory is being occupied, from their legalistic approach towards now our territory is occupied by Ukrainian garrisons, they will declare real war, and then they will go all in with these troops, as you're saying. So the level the level is like just escalating. And what you if I understand you correctly, you're saying we need to do everything. There needs to be something done that this doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, in fact, the evidence is already out that Russia is actually essentially, they haven't formally declared war, but Russian state media is already calling it a war for the first time in the last 24 hours. So, and the reason for that, of course, is because Ukraine is occupying territory that Russia has annexed and claims it as its own. So Russia
Under
can
their
now claim,
interpretation, yeah.
yes, under their interpretation, illegal annexations from our standpoint. But it's important to understand where Russia's coming from, and they're going to define this as a defensive war. In a defensive war, they are going to do everything they can, employ every weapon in Russia's arsenal if necessary, to expel the Ukrainian occupiers from newly annexed Russian territory, and it's going to end very badly for Ukraine. And that's why I actually care about the Ukrainian people. I don't support the Ukrainian government one bit. They're pretty. I view them as quite despotic and not too dissimilar from Putin's regime in Russia. But in terms of the Ukrainian people, we need, we want to, as Westerners, we want to do everything we can to protect Ukrainian lives and to minimize Ukrainian territorial losses. And the longer we take to negotiate a peaceful settlement, the more territory Ukraine will lose, and potentially, could lose tens or even hundreds of thousands of lives. So it really is, an imperative to turn to peace. And it's very unfortunate that the Biden administration made a decision. They said that when there was a summit that was scheduled between Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State in the U.S., as well as Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, that was scheduled right around February 22nd. And Blinken said if Russian forces cross the border into Ukraine, which at the time was actually the LPC and the DPC, the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, actually LPR and DPR, which were Russian separatist republics, not yet into Ukrainian controlled territory, then we would never meet or negotiate with anything with Russia, essentially until they returned to their pre-war positions or returned Russian forces to Russia. And that has completely, caused us to miss all these wonderful chances for peace, where Russia was willing to make peace on terms that were quite reasonable, difficult but reasonable to Ukraine, using Zelensky's own language at the time. He said it was difficult but not impossible in terms of the Russian terms, and it's a travesty. It's a travesty for the world that could escalate to a World War III that could cost the lives of hundreds of millions of Europeans and Americans.
Which leads me to the question why. It's like, we understand that this is the hot shooting war is between Russia and Ukraine, but the cold structural conflict is between, well, US, NATO, and Russia. And the obvious answer to solve everybody's security concerns would have been a neutrality for Ukraine from the get-go, from the start. I mean, even before 2014, and even more
Right.
so after 2014. And that would have been the obvious win-win-win solution on all sides in
Yes.
order to make sure that nobody has to die and everybody gets what they want. Why did that not emerge? It emerged in 1955 for Austria. It emerged in 1815 for Switzerland. Why not in 2022 for Ukraine?
I blame President Joe Biden. Before, when this war started, I called it Biden's war because Biden had a decision in January. He could have chosen peace, which would have been the neutrality route, or he could choose war, and he chose war. And the reason he chose war is because the Biden administration is filled with Atlanticists, and Atlanticists are much like neoconservatives. They believe that NATO is the be-all and end-all for U.S. national security. It's the cornerstone of national security, and therefore they had this pride and hubris and selfishness that they would refuse to, shut NATO's open door, close the door on NATO's open door policy, which is the open door policy being, in theory, that any country in Europe can apply for NATO membership. But that's not in in the U.S. National security interest, and it's certainly not in France's or Germany's national security interest. And they actually have leaders who realize that. And France and Germany vetoed Ukrainian NATO membership in 2008, and in all the years since, when it has been discussed, and wisely so, knowing that it would propel NATO into a unnecessary conflict or war with Russia. And so it was a secret. It was kind of an open secret that Ukraine would never become a formal member of NATO. And all Biden had to do was admit that on paper. That's all he had to do, was admit that for whatever reason that Ukraine would never join NATO. And he could have simply cited, because NATO members can't agree. They are not agreeing, and there's no foreseeable future in which they will agree that Ukraine will join NATO. And simply by making that diplomatic admission a fact, the war could have been entirely averted, I believe.
I mean, making Ukraine part of NATO now would import the entire war into the NATO territory, because Ukraine defines its state territory as everything, including Crimea and those four republics, right? Which now would create a perfect legal, on both sides, a perfect legal deadlock, or not deadlock. I mean, a reason to shoot, right, on both sides, if that happened, as it does currently for Ukraine. So the Europeans at the moment, I don't know what's up with them, because we had this instance where Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, stands next to Joe Biden, when Joe Biden says we will shut down Nord Stream 2 if it comes to that, obviously threatening military intervention against partially German-owned and Russian-owned infrastructure. And Olaf Scholz just stood there and took it. And I don't get that. This flies in the face of all of the realist assumptions about states also wanting to assert themselves. I mean, are the Europeans at the moment that dependent on the US, or is the pressure coming from the US on the European NATO allies that big that they will just stand down even when threats against them are made?
Yes, I do believe that's the case. Germany, of course, is not a great power. In order to be a great power, and today you have to be a nuclear power. North Korea is a great power. France and Britain are great powers. Russia and China, of course, have nuclear arsenals as large or larger than our own. But yes, I think Europe continues to be very much U.S. led when it comes to defense issues, and they often seem to just salute and follow whatever orders come from Washington, whatever policy, no matter how detrimental or threatening and risky it can be to their own security. And I think they do that because of the U.S. Nuclear umbrella. It's understood that if Russia were to invade, and actually this, it's likely not the case. If Russia were to invade NATO, there's the chances of the U.S. resorting to tactical nuclear weapons, even if Eastern Europe was overrun entirely by the Russians, are almost non-existent. But it's still kind of an understood situation from the Cold War that that we have a nuclear umbrella over NATO, and so I think France and Britain having, quite modest nuclear arsenals, they understand that, I mean, if in fact Putin were this aggressive, Stalin-esque type dictator that wants to invade and conquer half of Europe, then I think that would be a really good assumption. They just have to do whatever the U.S. says, but that is not the case. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I actually said that I thought this was kind of the beginning of Putin's moves in Europe, and thought that he was bent on establishing an imperial Russian confederation in which he wouldn't annex very much territory, but he would want to return all the former Soviet republics outside of the Baltics to the Russian orbit. And his actions since then have proved that assumption false. In that, given the chance to keep Russian forces in northern Ukraine, he willingly withdrew them when he didn't have to. A dictator who's been on conquest of Ukraine, or Europe, let alone Ukraine, wouldn't have withdrawn from 3 Ukrainian oblasts at the beginning of the war. But that's exactly what he did. So he proved at that point that his only interest was in establishing a land bridge from Russia to Crimea, and then negotiating a peace settlement in which Russian forces would be withdrawn from Kherson and Zaporizhia. Now, after 7 months of failed diplomatic efforts to negotiate a peace settlement ending the war, he did exactly what I predicted he would do 5 months ago when I said there was a 55% chance that Zelensky would continue to reject all negotiations with Russia, and that Putin would then move to his plan B, which was to annex all Russian-occupied territory. So this was very predictable. It's something I predicted it back in April that would occur, assuming the status quo continued. It was a very avertible outcome, much like the war. None of these annexations would have had to take place. The Donbass region, of course, there would have been a popular referendum there, which, with Russian control of most of the Donbass region, likely would have gone Russia's way. So, but that would have been a loss of 6.4% of the territory the Ukrainian controlled before the war. Now we're looking at, they've already lost additional 15%. So that's much worse than 6.4. And I think that there's a very real risk of them losing 50 to 100% of their territory if the war continues through spring of next year.
All the Russians that I talk to on this podcast, like the academics and military strategists, they all strike me as extremely realist in their assessments. And when I read what comes from the Kremlin directly, especially Sergei Lavrov, he tells us, like, John Mearsheimer gets us right. John Mearsheimer understands it, and so does do the other realists, like including the big what's his name, 92-year-old
Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger, yes. They say, like, these people understand what is up. 99, right. Sorry about that. And this basic tenet of diplomacy under a realist premise is that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And you can see how, like, Russia invaded, went all the way to Kiev, and once the negotiations in Istanbul started, they started retreating. In the Western media, this was immediately portrayed as Russia is weak, Russia is weak, Russia is losing the war. Right. But you can see how, like, the diplomacy and warfare was going on at the same time in opposite proportions. Basically, the higher the diplomacy, the less the attacks from Russia. But this is automatically interpreted as weakness, just as the retreat at the moment in order to gather new forces in order then to have an even bigger attack is being portrayed by our media as Russian weakness. Russia's losing the war. Where does this come from? This is.
Yeah, it's insanity. It just this whole mentality of strength versus weakness, and we have to show strength, and Putin's automatically Hitler, even if he's not. I mean, all of these false assumptions that blind Western leaders into pursuing actions that are most detrimental to their own people and to their own security. I mean, that's the crazy thing is, I'm a champion of U.S. national security, and I dare anyone to show evidence otherwise. But I believe that the U.S. should only defend its vital interests, and those vital interests don't extend into Russia's and China's sphere of influence. Russia and China have spheres of influence, whether we admit it or not. And I've written a proposal about, recognizing at least de facto spheres of influence and ensuring that U.S. military stops sending, we stop sending U.S. military forces into Russia's and China's spheres of influence. And that's the very thing that is propelling us to a necessary third world war, is that we keep trying to defend, essentially send our troops and ships to the periphery of the Russian and Chinese borderlands and seas. And, Taiwan obviously is indefensible. President Trump recognized that. If he were president, that he would not have defended Trump. Biden, on the other hand, has said not have defended Taiwan, and Biden has said that we will, and that would spark a war not only with Russia or with China, but with Russia as well, because they're now military allies. Been had a military alliance since 2000 in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and finally, Western analysts have admitted that with their No Limits Partnership Declaration in February. So it's critical that we move to peace. We see things as they really are. I mean, you talked about Lavrov being a realist. In the old days, the U.S. won the Cold War against the Soviet Union because we had realist presidents. Every single one of our presidents were realists. Not one of them said, we need to fight the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. They all said, that's the Soviet sphere of influence. We will not interfere. In 1956, we had massive U.S. nuclear supremacy. We could have fought and won a nuclear war against the Soviet Union in 1956 because their arsenal was so small. And Eisenhower wisely said, we are not going to intervene in Hungary. Czechoslovakia, we still had superiority, but they almost had nuclear parity. And LBJ said, we're not going to intervene in Czechoslovakia when there was a rebellion there and Czechoslovakia was invaded. No one who knows President Reagan would have thought that even under these circumstances that he would have authorized massive military aid to Ukraine. We just don't have realist presidents anymore. We have neoconservative presidents like George W. Bush, and then we have liberal internationalist presidents that believe in strongly in military intervention. That's multilateral sometimes, but nevertheless military intervention, unnecessary wars. And President Trump was the sole exception to that. And a lot of people don't like President Trump, and at least he was a realist.
President Trump, if the reports are correct, called off a strike against the Iranian military facility that struck down a U.S. military drone, which, if that attack against the Iranian mainland had happened, would certainly have been another war over there. But I don't know if that's really the case or not. But if it is one of the things that he should be remembered for the most, the war that didn't happen. But on the, Jack Matlock, 92-year-old former U.S. Diplomat, last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, is very proud of the fact that his generation with Reagan managed to end the Cold War by negotiation. And he is very adamant about saying like the Cold War ended in 1989, negotiated and settled because it was in the interest of both great powers. And the Soviet Union only broke apart 2 years later, which the US was actually against. Even George Bush Sr. went to the Ukrainian parliament and advised against independence and the independence declaration, because the danger of a nuclear fallout and a civil war was so great. And Gorbachev managed to not have that happen, which is another a great success, right? But at the moment, it seems that we are going in the opposite direction. It seems that everybody, at least in the West, seems to, and in Russia too, seems to interpret that the only way forward is military strength and nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to figure out a way to do is to have this grand alliance between left and right, all the peace faction on the left and all the peace faction on the right. And we need to work together and unite. And I mean, I don't know if we need to have protests or rallies, but we should have rallies. We should have speakers, whether they're nationalists or liberals or conservatives, that rally us against this mindless drive to a world war with Russia. There's no reason for it. Right now, we're looking at potential nuclear war over the fate of 5 million citizens of the 5 or rather the 4 Ukrainian regions that were just annexed by Russia. We can all admit that it's a sad thing that 5 million Ukrainians, 3 million of which don't want to be part of Russia, maybe more, are now part of Russia. We don't need to concede that that's the case in terms of a formal declaration, but that is essentially what we're fighting for right now. Now, Biden continues to misrepresent this war as a fight for the independence of Ukraine, and that's absolutely false. He's basically stated that Putin's only goal is the Russian conquest of all of Ukraine. And from day 2 of the war, Russia made clear that if Ukraine satisfied Russia's conditions, all Russian troops would be withdrawn from Ukraine except for the Donbas region. So that's 2 provinces out of, I don't know, about 15 to 20 Ukrainian provinces. And again, that loss would be lamentable, but that would be 6.4% of Ukraine's territory that it controlled before the war. And this is not an existential fight for Ukraine. Zelensky understands that, but he continues to deceive the Ukrainian people and the West in claiming it is, because he was given a blank check of unlimited Western military assistance by Boris Johnson and the Biden administration back in April that caused him to abandon the tentative peace deal, which again was reasonable to Ukraine, that was agreed to between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul in late March. The only remaining point of contention that existed prior to the Russian withdrawal from northern Ukraine was the borders of an independent Donbas region. And whether that would be the pre-war borders, in which it was about 1/3 Russian and 2/3 Ukrainian control, or Russia's position, which it should include 100% of the Donbas region. So that could have they could have split the difference, and it would have been not great for Ukraine, but Ukraine would be much stronger, more prosperous today. Right now, they have 7.5 million refugees that have left the country. Their population has been reduced to under 30 million people that are actually residing in Ukraine. And they've lost 50% of their jobs, or rather 50% of their businesses have closed down, and they're expected to lose 60% of their GDP. By contrast, Russia is only believed to lose, that it will lose 6% of its GDP during this year. So the consequences have been far worse for Ukraine. It's been a humanitarian catastrophe, and it's one that was avertible, and it could be resolved very quickly with a ceasefire, an armistice, ending the war, peace negotiations, and then the process of reconstructing Ukraine economically can begin.
I keep emphasizing that I'm living in a country that has been prospering over the last 75 years thanks to surrendering. Because if it hadn't, it would have been catastrophic for Japan. It would have been a catastrophe, absolutely. And something you said before was very important. The realization that at the moment we're seeing something domestically in Europe and in the US that's quite interesting. The convergence of left and right. I am clearly a lefty. I think you are on the right side, but we both agree, if we realize if we analyze this situation rationally, we come to the same conclusion, which is Russia needs to be negotiated with. It can be negotiated with, and there's ample room in order to create a situation where like everybody is going to prosper and gain out of a peace agreement. This wasn't there before. Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard clearly on the same side. Henry Kissinger and the lefties of the old days all on the same side. So it is really strange, this realignment of international political thinking. Noam Chomsky and on the same side with Kissinger, right? Do you see a way forward to capitalize on this and push for peace, realist peace?
So there's a huge disconnect between the Western leaders, who are generally pro-war and very anti-Russian, anti-peace, and the people. I mean, there was a recent, I think it was the Council on Foreign Relations for Europe or some institution like that, recently conducted a poll of EU countries, and it wasn't EU-wide, but it was multiple EU countries, probably about 9 of them. And in every country but Great Britain, but Great Britain, the polls results came back. So there was a question. It was asked, do you support peace through justice? I think it was peace through justice or peace through diplomacy. And they defined peace through justice as fighting Russia until, forever, essentially, indefinitely, until Russia is expelled from Ukraine, and we hold Putin responsible for war crimes, which is laughably absurd, and never happened. Completely unrealistic and flight from reality. And then the other option being a diplomatic solution, which would end the war very quickly with a compromise peace proposal, what I call a Wilsonian peace without victory, named after his speech that he gave in 1917, back when he was January 1917, when he was in receipt of a peace proposal from Germany, which would have ended the war favorably in terms of an Allied perspective. And that peace was lost, unfortunately. And I see the same thing that's occurred here. We had a favorable peace offer, I think, from a Western perspective, and that peace has now been lost because we've really given Putin no choice. I mean, he has been, I wouldn't say desperate to end the war, but he's been very motivated to end the war in Ukraine ever since April. And he's from day 2 of the war, he's had a peace proposal on the table, and we've given him no choice but to escalate and either overwhelm Ukraine entirely by taking the capital of Kyiv and possibly overrunning all of Ukraine, forcing Zelensky to flee and form a government in exile, and probably Ukrainian counterinsurgency, or to use nuclear weapons to end the war. So those are the only 2 options. We've given President Putin, who everyone says, all the Western leaders say is a madman, irrational, has 8,000 nuclear weapons, and those are the choices we've given him. So either of those 2 choices will result in a massive Russian victory, and it will be terrible for the people of Ukraine, and we'll be worse off as well in terms of what everyone's considering our own national interests. And so we need to give, just like Kissinger said, we need to give Putin an option, a face-saving way to fall back. And the only way to do that at this point is a ceasefire proposal, because there's no way that Russia is ever going to give up any of the territory which it annexed on the 21st of September.
Yanis Varoufakis calls this a gilded bridge. Another lefty who's absolutely on the same point. Give a way out to your opponent, right? To a face-saving way out. What was the result of the poll that you mentioned?
So Italy, of course, was the most overwhelming in terms of, I think they had a majority of their population choose diplomacy over, peace until the bitter end, continue the war to the last Ukrainian. And then I think either Britain or Poland, I forget if Poland was one of the countries polled, but of course, if it was, that it would have been the most, pro-war, and then I think followed by Britain. I talked to someone recently that noted that British intelligence is probably the worst in terms of lying about the war. And I've been saying for almost since the war began that 80% of what we hear from the Western media is propaganda. It's war propaganda, whether it's Ukrainian or and it is initiated by the Western government that issues it. So it really takes, that's really what we're up against. You talk about how can we get out of this nuclear escalation spiral, essentially, that we're in, that ends with either world war or a nuclear world war. And it's very difficult because the people are so misinformed. They have so much disinformation. They don't understand the actual reality, as Sergei Lavrov and Kissinger and Mearsheimer all understand, and you and I understand. And so we just need leaders. We need Western leaders that are courageous, that support peace, to come out and be bold and hold rallies against further military escalation, and to just come out in favor of a ceasefire and just say, we support all of Ukraine's goals to try to get, liberate as much territory as possible from Russia. But realistically, there's only one way that's going to happen. That's diplomatically. ironically, it's Ukraine that stands to gain the most from a diplomatic solution, and it's Ukrainian leaders that are acting in opposition to Ukrainian national security interests that are doing everything they can to sabotage the peace in the hopes that the US and NATO will join the war against Russia. And with US and NATO military forces in Ukraine, they'll be able to liberate Ukrainian territory from Russian occupation, even though Russia has far more nuclear weapons, many times more nuclear weapons than the US and NATO combined.
The only way to get Russia out of these four provinces and of Crimea is if you manage the will to go all the way to Moscow, which needs NATO, right? And that's the will to go to nuclear war, and that's insane. That's insane. That's the end.
Yeah, Russia will escalate to the nuclear level the minute that US and NATO ground forces enter Ukraine. That's when they'll
Officially.
escalate. It won't. That's when they'll escalate. Yeah, exactly. Because a recent article that I read said that Biden's are increasing the number of special operations troops that are operating in support of Ukraine in Russia. We don't know if any of those are engaged in direct combat, but for many months we've known that they're helping to direct military operations, perhaps at Ukrainian military headquarters, and coordinating what targets, what Russian military targets are the most advantageous to attack.
Now we are talking World War III kind of level of escalation. That is now seriously a possibility. It's not a given, but it's on the table, which is absolutely mind-bogglingly stupid. I hope we don't go that way. David, I could talk for you much longer. You've got a lot of very, very good insights, and I thank you for that. But I think we have to wrap it up, and maybe we can talk again in the near future. Hopefully, once this situation is de-escalating, at some point we have to get back. Otherwise, we'll blow ourselves up.
Yeah, we will. Absolutely will. Thank you for the opportunity to share my opinions.
Thank you very much for giving all the analysis. I appreciate it very much, and talk to you next time.
Thank you. Take care.